In this political season where people are borrowing words from others, it reminds me that I'd better be honest here, and the subtitle, A Hardy Perennial, is the title of the first chapter of a book by Charles Kindleberger, who was a great financial historian and actually was certainly instrumental in stimulating my interest in finance. And this was the first chapter of his book called Manias, Panics, and Crashes. And if you can still stand to think about crises after today's talk, that would be a book that I would recommend to your attention. So like Kindleberger, and this may be the only thing we have in common, I'm also a financial economist. And I have to note also in the spirit of truth in advertising that financial economists are not always the most favored of all the economists, I guess I would put it. Now, it may be because in business schools and on Wall Street, if you've got finance before the title of economics, you get an automatic premium. But it might also be because people are suspicious about our intelligence. And what I hope was an apocryphal story when Einstein came to Princeton and was introduced to a person who in advance he was told was really not very intelligent at all. On meeting him, Einstein immediately threw his arm around the guy's shoulder, hauled him off into the corner and said, "Listen, what can you tell me about it?" This is an exciting and maybe even a scary time to talk about crises because we seem to be in one ourselves. And it's scary because in this particular episode, surprises seem to be popping up in places where we don't expect that they're problems. But in fact, many crises throughout history have that characteristic. In a favorite crisis of mine, it started with disruption in commodity markets. And the banks that were exposed to that problem started having rumors circulate about their solvency. Then it next spread to some of the clients of the banks, which encountered some labor problems. And because they were going to be negatively affected, the rumors intensified about the banks being in trouble. After that, there were some episodes of fraud that cropped up, and again, a few banks were said to be impaired. There was some contagion that other banks in other countries were suffering from problems, and it was rumored that the banks in this money center had an exposure to those institutions. They might have made it through with only a strain on their liquidity when there was a problem with some loans to developing areas that went into default. And then the crisis really intensified, and of course at the worst moment, government got advised with an ill-advised reform that actually set off a run on the banking system. In the end, the strong man in the money center stepped in and injected liquidity into the banking system, allowed some banks to shut, and made it known that he was standing behind the remaining banks, and the crisis finally abated. Reason why I like this crisis is that the commodity market disturbance was several Roman galleys sinking in the Red Sea. The labor market problems was a revolt of the slaves. The foreign developing country defaults were, as Tacitus put it, the semi-civilized Belgians defaulting on their debt. And the strongman, of course, who stepped in was Tiberius Caesar. In later banking crises, such as what we saw in the Great Depression, FDR stepped in one Sunday in March of 1933 and shut the entire U.S. banking system, reopening it a week later minus several thousand banks. I guess I'm not quite sure what people are so concerned about today, Tiberius Caesar, FDR, and W. But anyway. here's what I'm going to try to do today. Since a lot of people don't really focus on the usefulness of the financial sector, I'll say a few words about what finance really does, and then turn to the topics that you see here. It's not a talk about today's crisis, but it's impossible for me to resist a few comments, and so I'll make a few statements. No investment advice, I'm sorry, or actually, you're lucky, no investment advice. Crisis prevention, by the way, is actually really easy. In 1360 in Barcelona, after a series of banking crises, a banker was taken outside his bank and beheaded. That worked very well at stopping crises, and it also stopped banking in the city of Barcelona. No one has called for the beheading of bankers yet, but we're going to see a number of proposals for harsh regulatory reform if some of the predictions of another 20% or more fall in housing prices actually takes place. The functions of finance are the ones that you see here. Many people argue that the allocation and monitoring of capital is the most important function that the financial system performs. Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate, refers to the financial sector as the brain of the economy, allocating its scarce capital to where it can be best used. But even mundane functions like gathering savings by putting together capital permit investment in bigger projects that can allow society to grow. Walter Bagehot, first editor of The Economist magazine, said that in Queen Elizabeth's time, even if somebody could have conceived of what a railroad was, they couldn't have conceived of the project because there were not the amounts of capital that could be pooled together to actually finance an undertaking as massive as that. The function that gets the least respect is the most mundane, namely making payments. And a short example of its importance that my students have to suffer through was written by Stanley Jevons, an economist who wrote a book on money and the mechanism of exchange in 1876. So it was probably a Williams text in the late 19th century. Recorded the following. He said, some years since, Mademoiselle Zélie, a singer of the Théâtre Lyrique in Paris, made a professional tour around the world and gave a concert in the Society Islands. In exchange for an air from Norma and a few other songs, she was to receive a third part of the receipts. When counted, her share was found to consist of 3 pigs, 23 turkeys, 44 chickens, 5,000 coconuts, besides considerable quantities of bananas, lemons, and oranges. At Les Halles in Paris, as the prima donna remarks in her lively letter, this amount of livestock and vegetables might have brought 4,000 francs, which would have been good remuneration for just 5 songs. In the Society Islands, however, pieces of money were very scarce, and as Mademoiselle could not consume any considerable portion of the receipts herself, it became necessary in the meantime to feed the pigs and poultry with the fruit. So these functions actually really matter, is the point here. And there's considerable empirical evidence that finance helps growth, helps people actually escape from poverty, helps people stay out of it. So that really is one key reason why we study crises. When finance breaks down, there's serious consequences for the economy, for individual people, as I'll report on in a minute. We might also be interested in crises because their occurrence seems to be increasing over time, especially in the last 2 decades. A database that I put together, a little bit more than 2 decades, says that we've had about 130 crises around the world since about in the early 1980s. The contagion aspect attracts attention. It was extremely scary to a number of people when in 1998 a crisis broke out in Russia, and the next place that popped up was Brazil. And the current subprime crisis, the first evidence that we saw of it was with banks that were having runs on them in Ireland, England, even Germany and Australia. Economists study crises much like doctors study disease, to learn about how to prevent the disease, but also to learn a little bit about wellness. Well, what is a crisis? The IMF, whose origin goes back to concern about fighting crises on the international scene, defines a crisis as when there's a run on a country's currency or on its banking system, or both. The IMF cares about this because if the payment system breaks down, that can lead to international contagion and a loss of output worldwide. The World Bank looks more at the developmental aspects of the banking system, and therefore has a broader conception of what constitutes a crisis. When any of those functions that I mentioned earlier are impaired, that hurts economic development, and therefore the bank would treat it as a crisis. My favorite definition, which tells us that today we're in a crisis, is by that well-known financial economist, Will Rogers, who said it's that when you're concerned about the return on your money, that you know you've got a crisis. Just to show you the impact of crises on poverty, in East Asia, in all three of these countries, for a couple of decades leading up to the crisis that began in 1997, poverty was on a significant downward trend. And this is measuring the number of people who live on less than $2 a day. After the crisis, we saw poverty rates, instead of decline, shoot up quite a bit. In fact, in Indonesia, the cost of the crisis at over 50% of GNP could have instead supported a tripling of healthcare and education forever. But instead, those dollars, or that money, was going to finance the crisis. In Argentina, in 2002, about a year after the crisis broke out, there was an episode reported. Word spread fast through the vast urban slums ringing Rosario. There was food on the freeway, and it was still alive. A cattle truck had overturned near this rusty industrial city, spilling 22 head of prime Angus beef across the windswept highway. Some were dead, most were injured, a few were fine. A mob moved out from Las Flores, a shanty town nearby. Within minutes, 600 hungry residents arrived on the scene wielding machetes and carving knives, and suddenly, according to accounts from some of those present, a cry went up, "Kill the cows, take what you can," and a slaughter broke out. In another crisis country, if this works, the Dominican Republic, this episode came to my attention when Sandro Batista smashed his banana truck into a tree in April, leaving him with 2 hideously shattered legs and a broken arm. His orthopedic surgeon sent his sister shopping. The country's largest public hospital, Hospital Dario Contreras, didn't have painkillers or the steel pins, screws, and plates to put Batista's bones back together, or even the blood to get him through an operation. Analysts here trace the decline in medical care largely to a single event, a banking crisis that cost about 15% of the country's GDP. So there are serious effects. Some people argue that finance doesn't have much of an effect on the real economy, but these episodes, I hope, make clear that in fact that it does. And what we can see from this picture is that the number of crises since late 1978 have been quite notable around the world. I don't want to go in too much into what constitutes a systemic crisis, so think of the countries that I guess are in pink, if I've guessed right, as a big crisis. Those in green are countries that have had a borderline or more modest financial crisis. So for the U.S. being in green, that refers to the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. The countries in gray are ones for which it was impossible to gather information. Since banking crises like molds and mildew grow best in the dark, that may be where some of the worst problems were, but we just don't have the data to verify it. And there are a number of countries, by the way, like Argentina, like Brazil on this map, who had multiple crises through this period. And if we extended to the present, maybe we'd have a few more countries that would be covered by the current crisis. So one has to ask then, well, why is the financial sector so fragile, so prone to crises? Research that was actually really pushed forward by two Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, showed how people in making decisions, including financial decisions, are subject to framing. The way the facts are framed to them affects their decision making. So for example, if you show investors identical data on bond and stock returns, but emphasize the volatility of those returns, same information, but emphasizing volatility, then investors will choose bonds that are less volatile than stocks. On the other hand, if you advertise or emphasize their average return over longer periods of time, they go with stocks rather than bonds. Individuals have a tendency to put much lower weights on experience in the more distant past, even though it might be just as relevant today as it was earlier. They trade on what economists call noise rather than fundamentals that could affect the value of companies. The popularity of Jim Cramer on TV, who rolls up his shirt sleeves and provides a lot of entertainment, of CNBC, which will comment on the day's movements in stock prices as if anybody could possibly understand that. It's not clear that we're that far from the Etruscans consulting seers or priests to interpret entrails. Investors also exhibit positive feedback. Charlie Kindleberger, I think, put it best when he said that nothing so disturbs one's good judgment and sense of well-being as the prospect of a neighbor getting rich. Sir Isaac Newton was smart enough in 1720 to sell his stock in the South Sea Company when it had appreciated from about 20 pounds per share to 80. And the stock price kept going up and up. It peaked many months later at about 1,000 pounds per share. What Newton couldn't stand was the fact that a lot of his friends and relatives were getting rich, and he bought back in when the market price hit 800 and lost a fortune. So markets can make fools of all of us, is a point to remember. Oops. And this cartoon is a favorite of mine that summarizes it. Now, in case you can't quite see it in the back, this whole thing starts by a stockbroker, this is a day on the stock market, saying I've got a stock here that could really excel. And as excel and then sell gets repeated, it sets off a stampede. Until finally, one person says, this is madness, I can't take it anymore, goodbye. And of course, that gets translated to buy. One of my favorite parts of this cartoon, by the way, is that the person who started is very consistent. He's still just trying to sell a stock. When you get a call from a stockbroker, please remember that. This is a Cal cartoon that first appeared in the International Herald Tribune in 1989. I thank him for sending me that. Okay, so, oops, why are we going back? Yep. Not sure why this ended up. Okay. The same button on the mouse has changed directions. Sorry. All right, so we've talked about why finance is fragile. What about banking? Because this is where a lot of the crises either start or end up. Well, one reason why banking is more fragile is because banks issue demandable debt. That is, that you want your money back, you can go back to the bank at any time to get it back. They've invested in illiquid projects, so they don't always have your money there, and they can't repay you. Many people here might own shares in mutual funds. An equity or stock mutual fund invests in a series of businesses. You don't know how much you're going to get. It depends on the performance of those investments. So we don't see a run on a mutual fund unless fraud is suspected. But we do more see runs on banks because if you get in there first while the bank still has some cash, you're likely to get yours back. And every Christmas we're reminded of this in the Jimmy Stewart movie, It's a Wonderful Life, where there's a bank run for essentially an episode of bad luck. Banks also engage in term transformation. They take the short-term dollars of their depositors and they transform that into long-term investments. As Jimmy Stewart reminded the depositors who were trying to get their money back, it's invested in Harry's house and George's barbershop, etc. Banks, at least in the last century, have been highly levered. That is to say, for a relatively small amount of the owner's capital, they could leverage that up, get a lot more deposits, and in effect gamble with other people's money. That didn't always used to be the case, by the way. Banks used to have to put up a whole lot more capital in order to persuade people that they were going to be safe enough that they could trust them with their deposits. But since we got into an era where it's accepted that the government will provide a safety net to support banks, the amount of capital that they've been forced to put up has actually declined markedly from levels like, say, 45 to 50% in the 19th century to 8% today. Banks are also opaque. Now, an economist would term this as there's an information problem or an asymmetry of information. A friend of mine who's a physicist reminds me that, well, there's information problems in every business. I, for example, wouldn't have a clue by walking past a nuclear power plant how safe it is. But the difference with finance is that insofar as we know, the nuclear particles have no incentive to mislead us about their activity, whereas bankers do. And indeed, you only have to pick up the papers to see that on many days. Banking also depends, importantly, on initial conditions. The initial portfolio that it starts off with, the skills of the bankers, how they're regulated, and probably most importantly, the information that they possess, because it's on the basis of that information that they really end up making a profit or loss. Information, however, is not always good, as this Dilbert cartoon reminds us. The providers of information have an incentive to take advantage of those who don't always ask enough questions. And indeed, in the current crisis, remember this started off with a series of very peculiar loans. They were called like ninja loans, where the borrowers didn't have to produce any documentation about their income, their jobs, their assets. When you have banks making loans promising not to gather any information, it would strike me that one really has to ask questions about what's going on. But long before this crisis started, there were some clear warning signs that something dangerous could have been going on. And I apologize for the faintness of this copy. So what this shows is for the top 25 banks in 2002, how much they were paying different accounting firms, KPMG, Price Waterhouse, etc., Arthur Andersen, which of course, for engaging in behavior like I'm going to suggest right now, with Enron went out of existence. So in the column labeled audit fees, here for example, you see how much they collect from the banks for auditing them and passing on the accuracy of their information. And in the last column, what their other fees are that they're getting from the same bank. And what you see for most of the institutions is, like say Morgan Chase was paying Price Waterhouse $21 million for auditing and $84 million in other fees. And so one has to ask oneself, what's the likelihood that Price Waterhouse was going to tell JP Morgan, you know, you really have some problems on your balance sheet, and risk losing the $84 million worth of business. And this was going on in the public domain. Oh, the mouse is acting up again. There we go. Emerging markets, where, if you remember that map, had a lot of the problems that I was talking about, they are maybe even more prone to crises because of the problems they see here. The information markets are far worse than they are in richer countries. The markets are smaller, and small financial systems we see throughout history fail at alarming rates. So as an example, in the United States between 1920 and 1933, roughly 15,000 banks failed. In Canada, which had exactly the same macro forces at work as in the United States, one bank failed in that period. The difference was the US started with 30,000 banks. All but about 700 of those banks were unit banks, only one office. Without being able to branch, they were not able to diversify their exposure, and we saw regularly in the 19th century, whenever disturbances passed through their area, the states with unit banks saw alarming failure rates. Those where the banks had branched, as they had in Canada, saw relatively little difficulty with bank failure. Developing countries are very similar to those states with very small banks. Indeed, we have a developing country whose entire banking system is smaller than Williamstown Savings Bank. Okay. Many of these countries liberalized their banking system, but when they liberalized it, the banking system was already insolvent, and it's that we only found out about the insolvency after the point of liberalization. And developing countries see a lot greater volatility in their markets than industrial countries do. So even the best bankers would have trouble. Now, one could argue that maybe like Tolstoy, that every unhealthy financial system is unhealthy in its own unique way. But in fact, there are a number of common features. And what we see, first of all, in many banking crises is that the banks usually start off getting in trouble. There may be some macroeconomic problem going on, but banks exist to actually help us deal with volatility. They should be planning for those disturbances, but they'll have made some mistake. Sometimes they will have deliberately gambled, like Monsieur Kerviel for Société Générale, taking very large bets. But in many cases, it's a technical mistake. They concentrated their risk. They didn't understand how much they were concentrating their risks. And because of that mistake, they get into trouble. Well, it's a natural human tendency to try to hide the trouble. This happens at the individual loan officer level. If a lending officer has a client that's having trouble paying back, they try to hide that fact from management in the bank. And one way they try to hide it is by evergreening the loan. That is, you give the troubled borrower another loan and deduct the proceeds that they owe you on interest for the first loan from that second loan, so the first loan still looks good. Okay. Bank management can collaborate in that process, and indeed, I've certainly seen cases where it gets so bad that the banks, in effect, invent their income statement from the bottom up. Normally, the income statement starts off with income that's coming in, like the interest that they receive. They subtract off the interest they have to pay out to their clients. They subtract off their expenses. They pay their, they get their profits, they pay their taxes, and they pay out some dividend. When a bank is in trouble, instead they do this in the reverse fashion. They start with what kind of dividend do they have to pay so that nobody suspects that there's a problem. And then they will invent their balance sheet from the bottom up, doing a lot of evergreening in the process if they have to generate enough interest income in order to pretend that they're solvent. The hope is, like it starts off at the bank lending officer level, that enough time will pass that the client will turn around, or the bad luck that they've had will reverse, and they'll work themselves out of a problem. A lot of times, however, this doesn't work. And so then they get involved with desperate mismanagement, where they'll take really big gambles. I thought we were going to go through this election cycle where I was the only person reminding people about John McCain's history with, as a member of the Keating Five, but the New York Times had it on the front cover today. What banks uniformly do is try to get regulatory relief so that their regulators will leave them alone while they work their way out of the problem instead of closing them down. And Charles Keating, who was president of Lincoln Savings and Loan, got 5 politicians, McCain being one of them, to try to lean on the regulator to back off. And the regulator did back off for a couple of years, and the losses for Lincoln Savings and Loans ended up being larger. The last stage of this process, if the gambling doesn't work, is that finally there's exit of one form or another. They may engage in outright fraud. They may flee to another country without an extradition treaty. Some bankers commit suicide at this stage. Now, don't try what I'm going to show you next at home, this is meant to tell you a little bit about gambling. Suppose you come into $1 million. Well, you can do the following bet. First of all, you can take $500,000 and you can go to Las Vegas. Let's suppose there's a very simple roulette wheel there to keep this chart manageable. And so there's just red and black, and you put it all on red, and let's say it pays off 2 to 1. So you either end up with $1 million or 0. Okay. But you remember you had that second $500,000. So what you do is take $500,000 and start a bank. Well, you might be able to collect 10 times that amount in deposits, or roughly $5 million. Get back on the plane, go to Las Vegas, put it all on black this time. Now you end up with either 0 if it comes up red, but then you've got your $1 million, or you've got $11 million. So no risk. Now, the good news is this is illegal. The bad news is, like Charles Keating, bankers legally can take a lot of very high-risk bets that basically amount to getting on the plane and going to Las Vegas. Okay. So this is what goes on in crises. Now, that's crises sort of close up at the bank level. How do they look from a greater distance? Well, what we see early on in a crisis is there'll be some selling of assets. We usually observe in wholesale markets or interbank markets, the markets where banks trade among themselves, that the market starts tightening, interest rates might rise. And I wrote out 3 crises here. So the Asian crisis of 1997, this started occurring. The signs were there in the spring, where it says late 06, 07. Sorry, I omitted a number. That's 1906, 1907. The panic that occurred about 100 years before our current crisis. And then the third observation is August 07, when we saw a seizing up of liquidity in the current crisis. A little bit later on, runs might spread to the retail level. You'll really then see credit drying up. A lot of different markets affected. One I saw today in the news, I think it was in Wilkes-Barre, maybe. It was some town in Pennsylvania where they were trying to borrow to finance a hockey ring for the local high school team, but they weren't able to borrow because rates have shot up for municipal bonds. That's a function of the current crisis that's going on. And you usually see an intensification of asset price declines, which was seen in these different episodes that I have here. In crises, we inevitably find episodes of fraud that either occur or get revealed when the crisis is well underway. In 97 to 99, we saw a number of cases of this in East Asia. In the panic of 1907, Knickerbocker Trust was a key bank, and it was affected by fraud. And of course, the biggest episode to date in history is Societe Generale, with the episode that was just revealed in January of this year. It will get to a stage where there'll be a series of rescue plans that will be announced. Some of these, unfortunately, are aimed at disguising the problem rather than trying to solve it. And many crises see this. The plan of Secretary Paulson was to allow banks to unload assets at prices that weren't going to be publicized. And one had to wonder how or whether that was going to help the banks at all. At some stage, one gets genuine rescue plans, and then finally we'll see some stabilization and recovery. Now, I'm sorry I prepared these charts a couple of days ago, finalizing them. The Federal Reserve just came out today saying that they don't see output coming back to its trend path until 2011. So that may be when the current events stabilize more. In some cases, problematic mouse. In some cases, the crises are more covert. This happens a lot in very low-income countries where we just see the financial system sitting there. The asset values are impaired, there's not much intermediation going on, and there's a long period of stagnation. We can actually see this in developed countries too, because as the Japanese authorities put off dealing with their crises, they basically lost almost a decade of economic growth. I'll only say a little bit about whether crises will be more frequent or not. We've already seen a pickup in the frequency of crises. Bob Schiller at Yale argues that the spread of capitalism, bringing 2 billion people more into a market economy, may have something to do with it. There also have been surveys on the degree of materialism, which certainly surprised me, since my generation grew up thinking that the 50s were a terribly materialistic period. It surprised me to find out that when you ask people, what do you identify as really being part of, or a key part of the good life, in the 1950s, only about a third of the sample answered it's all about making a lot of money. By the 1990s, 2/3 of the sample were giving that response. The expansion of media coverage, the fact that people can turn on a screen and find out about stock prices seems to be bad for their decision making. The more often people look at portfolios, the worse the decisions that they make about their investments. The rise of gambling might also be bad for investors and for crises. And if you think about it, this is supported not just by online gambling, but by states offering lotteries. It supports the notion that there really is a way to get rich very quickly, and the financial markets are one outlet for that, for those interested in that. Okay. Come on. Let's see if that works. Oh, sorry. Let's see if that one works. Okay. So we then have to look about trying to respond to crises. What can governments do? Well, they're confronted with this dilemma in terms of how they intervene. Governments uniformly, eventually, all governments, I think, try to rescue those particularly who are perceived of as being innocent victims of a crisis from the cost of it. The problem is, even for governments that are not trying to, say, bail out speculators to help out those who may have contributed to the crisis, it's very hard to separate the groups, and governments don't often do a good job of that. There's also a sorting out at the micro level, at the individual firm level, deciding, say in the current crisis, which homeowners are going to get to renegotiate their interest rate and stay in their homes. In other crises, which firms are going to survive, which banks are going to survive. Those are decisions that have to be made. And an important part in any crisis, or in any crisis manual for government officials, should be they need to focus on the preparation for the next one, because the policy steps they take now are going to have an impact on that. The good news is that governments may get forced to take over financial institutions, and they can do that. They've got the capacity, they've got the funds to do it, and the British authorities just did it last weekend with Northern Rock. The bad news is that empirical evidence tells us that governments are really terrible running banks, and the longer they do it, the more political purposes end up creeping into their management of the banks rather than the efficiency of it. So the conclusion ought to be that they should really, if they get involved in this, they've got to get rid of those banks as quickly as possible, return the assets to the private sector. When a private sector firm gets in any kind of trouble and is going into bankruptcy, what happens is pretty standard. As soon as the problem becomes known, they can't get any more money. Okay? Everyone accepts that management has a tendency to engage in fraud if the value of the company is below zero. And at the very least, they're going to reduce the effort that they put into the company. In fact, many times they'll be focusing on getting another job rather than by fixing their company. So money gets shut off, and the market forces the firms to downsize. Workers get laid off. Some managers get fired. It's not a pretty process, but there's a message that gets sent here, and that is if you get some of society's scarce capital and don't use it well, you're going to pay a very steep cost for that mistake. When it comes to banking, in fact, we find a reverse process. Many governments first inject the money and then don't take any of the hard decisions. Governments are terrible at collecting on assets. It doesn't win a lot of votes to go after people who are in tough circumstances to get their loans repaid. The banks don't get downsized, etc., and the regulators get off the hook. There have been articles about the current crisis that it represents a failure of market forces. We haven't yet heard the discussion of why didn't the supervisors get in early to prevent this one. So in times of crisis, I think it's useful for governments to remember that markets actually do a better job than they do at picking which ones should survive and which ones to fail. So one thing that a rule that they might use in trying to decide to intervene is not have public officials picking, say, which banks are going to survive and which banks are going to fail. Instead, just announce that there's a pile of money available, and it's available to anybody that gets private money in a matching amount contributed. And if a bank happens to get some of society's capital and a matching amount of private money, then they can't pay out any dividends. They can't pay bonuses to their employees or management. They need to adhere to very stiff transparency requirements because their first job is to pay the money back to the government. This may sound like, well, that's a sort of a textbook response, but this was the model that the US used in the 1930s, and in most cases, the government got its money back out of the banking system within 3 to 4 years. Unfortunately, in many countries since then, they've allowed the government to go in and decide who should the winners and losers be, and there's been a lot of corruption and a lot of political payoffs going on, so that the Keating Five was a rather small-scale episode relative to what we see in many developing countries. Crisis prevention, there are a few lessons that I would leave you with. First of all, you're never going to prevent crises, but you may be able to limit their occurrence, especially from what they've been in the last couple of decades. And the first rule is that financial systems need to be diversified. Many entities in the current crisis put a lot of their capital into assets that they were told were all rated AAA, supposed to be very high, very safe, but in fact it was concentrating their portfolio in one area, and that's always a mistake. Secondly, while I wouldn't go so far as to adopt the solution of the Barcelona authorities, trying to get around limited liability for those who are taking risks with other people's money strikes me as a useful way to limit crises. And there's some countries like Germany that do this. They interpret fraud as whenever if you're managing someone else's money, whenever you've acted in a way that's not consistent with the highest fiduciary standards. So they're able to convict a lot of people of fraud, and as a result, when someone's convicted of fraud, they have to pay out of their personal funds. And that limits risk-taking a little bit relative to the U.S. approach and others. Better regulation, of course, what is better? Well, certainly focusing on the information, the quality of it, the incentive conflicts that I indicated earlier is really important, and some attention to the way that actors in the financial sector are compensated. In the last several years, it's been possible for people in the financial services industry to make what used to be regarded as more than a lifetime fortune, all within a very, very short time, a year or two, getting paid fantastic bonuses. But then if losses were discovered from the strategy that they had adopted, they never had to pay those bonuses back. And it used to be the case, and in fact was started in this country, in New England, that when somebody became the officer of a bank, they had to put up a bond. And out of that bond, any losses that were made that were due to their decision making while they were a banker came out of that bond. Okay? We also had a system in Massachusetts called the Suffolk banking system, where bank supervisors were given an enormous bonus. I mean, in today's dollars, it would have been over $1 million a year, but that bonus was held until after they retired. And if there were any losses that were made in the banking system that they didn't catch, then those losses were deducted out of the supervisor's bonus. The nice feature of this is that over about the 25 or 30 year period where this was in effect in Massachusetts, the losses were very small, only a couple $1,000s, and in one case where bankers tried to embezzle money, the bank supervisors put together a posse, went after them, got them, and threw them in jail. And we don't seem to motivate our supervisors quite as well today. And in fact, if you go to developing countries where many of those crises that I pointed to earlier were occurring, we find that bank supervisors get a salary that might be 1/100th of what they could earn in the private sector. It's going to be very hard to get supervisors to do their job in that type of environment. Indeed, supervisory agencies around the world report that when they get somebody with a lot of skills, they very quickly move into the private sector. If these are ways to eliminate crises, one might ask then, well, so why isn't this being done? Well, in many points in history, officials have thought that they've reformed regulation in such a way that they have reduced the odds of crises. The problem that I think they've made is that they forgot to mind the store. They forgot really to look closely at what's going on in the sector and ask themselves if the earlier system is still working. So for example, with that earlier chart on accounting fees, when I went to graduate school, people were not going into accounting to get rich. Yet before the Enron failure, if you drove around the suburbs of Chicago or Houston, Texas, where Arthur Andersen had some of its major offices, you would have found that some of the nicest houses in the area were owned by employees of Arthur Andersen. And you would have had to ask yourself, why is this occurring? And what does it tell us about the information that we're getting in markets? Nobody was doing that at the time. So in other words, the message is that there's a dynamic to the evolution of the financial sector, and therefore there has to be a dynamic to the regulatory system. And until we do that, it's unrealistic to think that we're really going to be able to significantly reduce the occurrence of crises.